Greetings and welcome, or hopefully, welcome back. Thank you for coming. I'm glad to have you here. Before we begin, please take a moment to hit those like and subscribe buttons down below, and if you feel so inclined, drop us a comment. It always helps feed the algorithm. And while you're at it, go ahead and check us out over on Patreon. Lots of cool stuff happening over there. The link is in the video description and at the top of my YouTube page. And that was my cat. And speaking of Patreon, let me take a quick moment to give a shout out to my Tier 4 Patreon subscribers, Russ of the Frozen North, Neo5AC, and Nick. Thank you very much. Now, on with the story. Time and Tide. Chapter 3. Siege. Still in a state of shock, I walked with Anai as we limped and staggered numbly through the city towards home, holding each other up as we went. We barely even registered that we were following a long line of wounded people, all going in the same direction. We arrived at my home to find as much a scene of chaos and suffering as we had just left. The Temple of Healing lay immediately next to my home and was a relatively small building. With so many wounded coming in at once, there was simply no way they could all be helped there, so the healers commandeered the closest building they could, my house. We found Amma frantically in the process of turning the house into a makeshift infirmary, directing Amane and the household servants like a general on a battlefield. As we limped through the gate, Amane looked up from where she was helping one of the healers and screamed for Amma. My head was throbbing, and the world was beginning to swim again. Amma came running up just in time to help catch me as consciousness fled. I was alone, walking through the city. Everywhere I looked were empty houses and empty shops. I yelled, trying to find someone, anyone, but the only answer I received was the whisper of the wind and the echo of my own voice. Making my way to the city center, I climbed the Temple of Loomis. There was no movement at all from within the city, but something at the corner of my vision caught my attention. I looked out to sea. Several Imperial ships were on the horizon sailing away. I was on one of those ships. My hands and feet were bound in chains, and I was locked together with other youths from Katai. I looked around in fear and confusion, wondering how I got there. I turned and watched Katai slip below the horizon behind us. When I turned back around, there was no one on the ship but me, and I was no longer in chains. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it seemed as if the ship was different too. As I walked about on the deck, my thoughts were interrupted by a thunderous roar overhead. I looked up to see an immense ball of fire and smoke blazing a path across the sky. I awoke with a shriek as Amma cleaned my wounds with alcohol. My head was pounding and felt as if it would explode, and every inch of my body was in some degree of pain. The next half hour or so was as nightmarish as the battle had been. One of the servants held me down as Amma stitched up the wounds in my scalp and leg. She was angrier than I had ever seen her, and I could feel her anger in every stitch that she made. When she finished, she gave me a large glass of wine and made sure that I drank it all. "Amma," I croaked when I'd managed to stop crying. "Atta's home. He made it." "So that boy tells me," Amma replied with a glare. "And where is he? How is he?" I asked as I tried unsuccessfully to sit up. "He's outside and in about the same shape as you," she glowered. "He at least will live. You, on the other hand, are going to wish you hadn't." Remembering Atta's words, I started to cry again. "Oh, gods, Amma! The king!" I couldn't say anything more. The drugs and the wine were starting to take effect, and consciousness was beginning to slip away again. "I know," she whispered, as she quietly slipped out the door, leaving me alone with my nightmares one more time. The siege lasted for 3 years. For 3 years, Katai, a city full of women, children, and old men, and virtually denuded of able-bodied warriors, held off what at the time was the largest army ever assembled in the history of man. We were doomed, and we knew it, but sheer desperation kept us going from one day to the next. Several times the Imperial Army attempted to fire the city by launching burning pitch over the walls with large siege catapults they built on shore. One nice thing about living in a city like Katai, virtually the entire city was built out of stone, so their attacks did little but make us run for cover. Ata could not keep Anai and myself from the walls, so he took it upon himself to train us in the arts of hand-to-hand combat. He taught us the arts of the sword and the shield and spear. He also redoubled our bow training in hopes that we would rarely, if ever, have to get that close. He took a great fondness to Anai and saw to it, when time permitted, that he was well educated. A few days after Ata's return home, Ilamak ascended the throne of Katai, with Itziina acting as queen regent until he reached age of majority. There had been talk of marrying me off to him, but Ilamak himself quickly suppressed that idea. Itziina, in her wisdom, decreed that in the end he might have to marry outside in order to save Katai. His envoys to that effect went unheeded by the enemy surrounding the city. By the end of the first year of the siege, our food stores were exhausted. Hunger set in, then starvation. Once or twice, small groups of us were able to sneak out to hunt in the cover of the forest, but when the Atlanteans realized that we were doing so, they very quickly put a stop to it. The waters in the harbor and the river were abundant with fish, but even that had its limits. What fish could be caught were made to go as far as they would, but there was simply no way that everyone could be fed. Yet still we fought on. By the end of the second year, deaths by starvation were becoming a daily occurrence. Disease began to run through the population. There were also a few incidences of cannibalism. Such reports were dealt with harshly, but with pity. We were all starving. Yet still we fought on. One thing that must be said for the Atlantean army: they fought more civilized than we did. They patently refused to dam or poison the river that flowed through the city. They did not desecrate our dead as we did to theirs. Once a week for the first year, they would have an envoy stand atop a tower and call for our unconditional surrender. But we had come too far, lost too much to do anything but fight to the last person standing. When we refused to surrender, they would mass and attack. The third year was amongst the most terrible I have ever experienced in all my countless centuries of existence. Disease had reached plague proportions. The pyres for the dead burned day and night. It was hell on earth. By the end of that year, a little more than 4/5 of our population had perished. Ata and I watched helplessly as Amane finally succumbed to the ravages of hunger and disease and passed away. With the loss of Amane, Amma lost the will to go on and followed her within the week. Ata and I were devastated. All we had now was each other and Anai. Within another 2 weeks, Anai's entire family died around him. Ata took him in as a fosterling, and the two of us became closer than ever. Sadly, it was more like very close brother and sister than lovers, but we were utterly inseparable. We knew with grim certainty that the end was near for all of us. Ata redoubled his efforts in weapons training. He drilled us mercilessly until our reactions were automatic, were reflex. If we were to die, then he would make sure that we would die well and take as many of them as we could before we went. Every day, fewer and fewer people were left to defend the city, yet still, somehow, Despite the fact that the world was ending around us, those of us who were left managed to climb that wall day after day and fight on. We did this for another 10 months. Then one day, I was accompanying Etienne around some of the districts near the wall. She liked to walk amongst her people during the lulls between the attacks to boost morale. As we stopped to talk to a woman on the street, I heard a loud thump off in the distance. I looked up just in time to see a large stone flying through the air over the wall. Someone screamed, and suddenly I was struck from the side with such force that it knocked the wind out of me. I rolled up off the ground, gasping for air, and looked around. My savior and I had gotten lucky. That rock had sailed right in through where we had just been standing only a second before. Itzaina and her would-be rescuer had not been so lucky. It is a memory which haunts me to this day. The light went out of Katai. The will of her people died with our beloved queen. The next day, Illimak and Atta went out under a flag of truce to talk with the imperial envoy. They were there for several hours. When they returned, the imperial army marched in behind them. We laid down our arms and surrendered, fully expecting to be put to the sword. But we were beyond caring. Yet we were not slain. The enemy did not enter as weavers, as we had all expected. The soldiers were so in awe of our resistance, and so appalled by the conditions that they found within, that one of the first things their generals did was to order food be brought in to feed the surviving population. Healers and medicines were likely brought in to bring the plague under control. The siege of Katai was over. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am the Casual Deathworlder, your host, and this has been Time and Tide, Chapter 3. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. If you did, please go ahead and smash those like and subscribe buttons and drop us a comment down below. As always, a huge shout out goes out to my buddy Gregor. Thank you very much, buddy. I could never do this without you. Okay. Got one chapter left to go in this of what I have written. It's actually larger than chapter 1, so I will probably be doing that in 2, possibly 3 pieces. We shall see. Let me know if you liked it. So, not getting any feedback on this story really, so I'm kind of unsure as to whether or not people like it. Yeah. That said, as soon as this story is over, I will be beginning with Deathworld Origins. That will become our new midweek slot, at least for a few weeks until that story is played out. In the meantime, question, who's got the question? I know. How many of y'all are gym rats? I was one for a little while. I really need to get back into it. In the last year or so, I've put on a little bit of weight, and I need to get rid of it. Leave your answers in the comments down below. In the meantime, I'll see you next time. Be safe. Be well. I love you all. Bye-bye.